Welcome to another episode of Equity Mates. My name is Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy Ren. How are you going?
I'm good, Bryce. Great to be back for the second part of our four-part long-form interview this week.
That's it. We are welcoming back to the studio Nick Guidera from Eley Griffiths Group. Nick, welcome.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So yesterday, Nick, we touched on the process that you go to find small caps, a bit about the universe that you're working in and your scope framework. Today, we're going to have a chat to you about your thoughts on how businesses have reacted to the pandemic in the last 18 months, because we came across a recent Sydney Morning Herald article that you wrote, really saying that Australian businesses are resilient and many have not wasted a good crisis. So what do you mean by this?
Look, the reason I penned the article is we were talking internally about sort of what we learnt from the past 18 months. And as investors, we've certainly been challenged a lot around our consensus beliefs. I think, when the pandemic was right in the midst of things in the beginning of 2020 or March 2020, we were questioning what a defensive stock was, because all of a sudden a REIT that historically paid rent every month was no longer paying rent because no one was in the office. So I think we had these epiphanies around what was a COVID beneficiary, what was a COVID reopener, what was a COVID loser, COVID winner, and on that reflection, we tried to sort of put into words what we thought we learnt from the pandemic, and we settled on sort of 8 lessons. And why we think Australian businesses have been relatively resilient is because there've been plenty of people that have done it tough during the pandemic. There's a lot of small businesses that have done it really tough, but a lot of the larger businesses that are listed in this world have used the pandemic to their advantage to either grow their market position, expand their margins, diversify supply chains, and change the way they've done business. And not everyone's done that. And there's certainly been examples where there've been industries that have been unable to do it, like the travel industry, because it's been pretty much ground to a halt. But I think as a whole, we've seen the Australian corporate community being relatively resilient. That could be part to do with our COVID experience relative to the rest of the world and the economic support that our governments sort of made available to corporate Australia and to Australian mums and dads. But I think as a whole, we think that the corporate Australia's come out in a relatively resilient position, and happy to talk more about that one.
The reason I loved this article was because a lot of the market commentary we get around lockdowns and reopenings really starts and stops there. How long are we going to be locked down for? When are we going to reopen? And there's an implicit assumption that when we reopen, things will get back to normal. But what your article really stepped through was that this period has driven a lot of long-lasting changes that, across different industries will affect different businesses for years to come. And so it really got us thinking, about what that will mean. And you had some good case studies in there as well that would love to step through. The first change that you wrote about was how large retailers have reset their margins. And you used the example of Premier Investments to, I guess, illustrate that point. So let's start there. What did Premier do and what can we learn from this?
So, Premier Retail operates a number of key brands across Australia, like Smiggle and Peter Alexander. They have a variety of fashion retail. They themselves were subject to lockdowns from both calendar year 20 and calendar year 21 in different states. But what they did is, for the first time in a while, they were able to sort of regain the power with the power of the landlords. If you go back 2 or 3, even 4 years ago, there were a number of retailers that were under pressure from the likes of Scentre Group and Stockland, who had large retail shopping centres where they were the only place where foot traffic was still very much, you had to be in those centres. And given the consolidation amongst shopping centre REIT owners, there wasn't a whole lot of choice in terms of whether you could go to Westfield or there wasn't 3 or 4 other choices. So Westfield certainly wielded the power of rents. And what Premier did was effectively use the opportunity to renegotiate rent relief and took about 2.5% out of their rent costs on a sustainable basis by talking to landlords and saying, well, in this environment, we can't afford to have our stores open. So we either close them or we look at reducing rents. And what you've seen is sort of a structural reduction in rents that have been now reset for a number of periods going forward. There's ultimately just flowed straight into their EBIT line because rent is obviously a large cost for a number of bricks and mortar retailers. And Premier wasn't alone in this. A number of retailers have used the pandemic to renegotiate rent positions. Now, there were rent relief opportunities provided, during particular periods of lockdown, but keep in mind, most retailers were only locked down for the first lockdown around 6 to 8 weeks. And then, they've had to endure different periods of lockdown over the last 12 months. And obviously anyone in Victoria has had a far worse position. But I think it has allowed retail management to sort of look at their cost base and say, how can we run these retail stores more effectively? Let's address rent, which is one of our biggest costs, and ultimately they've won the battle.
The article, you then turn to look at the increase in near-term investments that businesses are making. The likes of Redbubble, Adore, and Breville. So what can we learn from this?
Well, I think if you look at something like Temple & Webster, a big online e-commerce retailer, had huge amount of success in growing sales, through 2020 into 21. What they've done is they've looked back and said, hey, well, we could either keep this revenue rate going, but at some point this party's going to come to an end and people will go back to the bricks and mortar retailers. So we can either use this opportunity now to reinvest in our customer acquisition, reinvest in our website, reinvest in our app development, so that when the pandemic ends and life resumes to normal, we can ensure that our growth rate in revenue is closer to sort of 20-30% rather than sort of going backwards. So I think there's a number of examples like Temple & Webster, like Adore, like Breville, like Redbubble, who've signaled that unfortunately, the profitability that we've generated during the pandemic may be one-off in nature, but trust us, we're going to invest the revenue, the incremental revenue that we've generated during this period to set up our businesses for sustainable businesses in the longer term. Now, in some instances, the market didn't like that. In Redbubble is a good example where they said, well, hang on a second, we thought these EBITDA numbers that you've been printing in the last 2 years are potentially sustainable. But ultimately, we think that those companies that are taking that hard decision now will be a lot more successful down the track.
So, Nick, speaking of investing for the future, one, I guess, part of your article that really caught my eye was the opportunistic acquisitions. I think you mentioned 2 or 3 examples of Australian companies that went offshore in some cases and acquired companies perhaps at significant discounts to their intrinsic value just because of the market conditions that we're in. So I guess, can you give us some of the examples that you think we should be aware of, and then what you think that means longer term?
I think this is probably one of the most fascinating part of this period of time is you have seen some CEOs make some really brave moves. I mean, Jamie Ferris, the CEO of Corporate Travel that owns large corporate travel agencies across Australia, New Zealand, the US, UK, got on a plane in September last year and went to the US and bought a business in the depths of a pandemic when corporate travel was, running at 8 to 10% of previous volumes. Global flights were pretty much at a standstill, and he saw an opportunity to buy a business that he'd looked at pre-pandemic at a significant discount to where he had talked to this particular vendor in a pre-pandemic world, because he was confident that on a 2 to 3 year basis that travel would return, and that this was going to give him an opportunity to grow his US footprint to be far more meaningful to win a number of
Oh, no.
corporate accounts, and then also an opportunity to then grow the US business as well. So I think that certainly stands out as one issue. There was one particular deal that I think was really well done. The other one would be Lovisa. Lovisa had most of its stores closed in France and the UK. Shane Falshire bought a business in the UK, I think for €60 only, and that expanded his store footprint across 6 European nations at a time when most of his retail stores were closed. Again, pretty brave move. But you've seen the Lovisa share price 12 months on from that acquisition, and it's fair to say, as European markets have reopened, it certainly looks particularly appealing. The final one is IDP Education, a large student placement agency where they rely on international students moving around the country, or moving around the world, I should say, to get education in different countries. It was fair to say that, it was pretty brave to go and buy an Indian business in the middle of the Delta outbreak earlier this year, when their own Indian business was under pressure. But again, India is one of the largest IELTS market, which is the test that international students must do for English proficiency. They now own that market and are confident that Indian students will resume their international travel in years to come. So there's just some great examples of acquisitions which to date appear to be purchased at market lows, with significant upside opportunity if management execute. And so far, in those three examples, the market is giving management the benefit of the doubt, and the early signs look good.
Just to close out, briefly, when we're looking forward now, do you expect there to be any other lasting changes, out of the pandemic that we haven't perhaps covered?
I think you're going to see more diversification of supply chain, because relying on one particular country that might be subject to disruption could be challenging. I think you're going to see perhaps a bit more adaptability from boards in terms of changes in dividend strategy, or just general changes in strategy, because the pandemic's kind of taught the market and investors that things can change and strategies need to be put on hold and guidance needs to be suspended for a period of time. But and as a result, the market has been somewhat conditioned for change, versus I think prior to the pandemic, any change was viewed particularly negatively. So I think in a way it gives corporate Australia somewhat of a not an outlet, but an opportunity for them to change the way in which the narrative comes from these companies going forward. And I think probably finally, the pandemic's taught corporate Australia to be resilient, to be adaptable, to change, to move online if you need to be, to make your business model pandemic proof. And I think as a whole, the majority of corporate Australia have done a pretty good job in doing that.
Yeah, it's been pretty fascinating to see, and I love the examples you gave of some of those CEOs and managers taking the opportunities in front of them and seeing that. It's kind of that classic Buffett buy when others are fearful, and they've certainly done that. So, look, that was really interesting, and I'm sure a lot of our community would have taken a lot from that as well. But Nick, we have run out of time, so looking forward to hearing your 3 stocks on your watch list in tomorrow's Watch List Wednesday. But until then, we'll catch you tomorrow.
Thanks for your time.
And that brings us to the end of another episode here on Equity Mates on AusBiz. As you just heard, we'll have Nick back tomorrow for Watch List Wednesday, 3 stocks on his watch list. So Ren, we'll pick it up then.
Can't wait.